Thanks a lot also for the invitation to this very nice format, this seminar. And it's, of course, my pleasure to present you some of our recent research and also to discuss it together with you. I just already gave my okay for the enregistrement, so I had to click, so that seems to be fine. And I will immediately share my screens, my slides with you, which I would like to show. Voila, does that work? Very well. Okay, so as it has already been announced, my presentation will focus on the question, how effective are integration policy reforms? And I will look at the case of asylum-related migrants in Switzerland. As you can see below, and I think the article has also been circulated among all students, this basis on a recent publications together with an economist, Marco Pecoraro, a demographer, Philipp Wanner, and my colleague in social psychology, Eva Green, and I am a political scientist. So we are really, this is really a very interdisciplinary research project and publication. On which this research basis. So the point of departure of our study is, does integration policy improve labor market, social inclusion, but also, let's say, psychological well-being and inclusion of asylum-related immigrants? Sounds like a super simple question or a trivial question, but it is not, as so often in research or in social sciences. The situation is a bit more complex, and I will also explain you why it is a bit more complex and show you how we dealt with this complexity in this study. So can everyone hear me well? Just to thumbs up? Yeah?
Yes.
Very well. So it starts all with the definition of integration policy, right? Integration policies, that's not just one thing or a clearly definable concept, but it's contested. And according to the literature, there seems to be at least some established consensus that it's a multidimensional concept. Policy steering the cultural or religious, the socioeconomic, and also the political integration of immigrants. So in line with Enzinger, who already asserted in the early 2000s that immigrants need to find their place in the nation, the market, and the state respectively, we choose to formulate this multi-dimensional and transversal understanding of integration policy. This definition also kind of shows clearly that the policy field cuts across different areas, policy areas and fields that are typically dealt with in different literatures and in different disciplines, such as economics, political science, or political psychology, right? So let's have a quick look at these different literatures and what they say about policy effects on immigrant integration. And what holds for integration policy holds, of course, also for integration itself. It's a contested term, and there are some empirical studies that try to define some concepts and measures of integration policy. Of immigrant integration. What you see here is the concept proposed by Ager and Strong, based on some qualitative but also quantitative research and a vast literature review. So. And the fields of integration emerging from this concept, they kind of overlap with what we would typically classify as integration domains. So you have some markers and means, employment, housing, education, etc., some social connection measures, social bridges, social bonds, etc., facilitators of integration, such as language and cultural knowledge, or questions related to safety and stability, and as the bottom line, the foundation, or political rights and access to citizenship. So let's start with this political rights and citizenship, and not surprisingly, it's mainly political scientists who are interested in the question of how integration policy affects these political rights and access to citizenship. And from this research, we find that inclusive integration policies benefit, for instance, immigrant civic engagement. So civic engagement goes up. We found also, so that's my former PhD student, Salomon Ben-Nour, who found in his article that inclusive policies do also increase the intention to naturalize, no? Especially if the people have been exposed to these inclusive policies over a certain time. They also foster immigrants' governor support. That's what we found in a US study with my colleague Alexandra Filindra, more inclusive policies. They increase people with an immigrant backgrounds support of the incumbent government. But interestingly, it's not inclusive policies, but restrictive policies that increased immigrants' voter turnout, right? And that's, we explained this particular finding with the mobilization via threat, which is a typical kind of argument that you find in the literature, that if there are some kind of restrictive policies that threaten your rights or may restrict your rights, then you go on the streets, protest, and also vote. So that's what we find in this research. Let's turn to the second outcome, employment. Not surprisingly, it's mainly economists who are interested in this question of how immigrant integration policy affects employment outcomes among the immigrant population. And here the evidence is much more mixed. So we have some large-scale studies that use some aggregate policy indices like the MIPEX, Migrant Integration Policy Index, which find a rather weak or absent relationship between a certain policy in a country and the labor market integration of the immigrant population. Then you also have some small-scale quasi-experimental studies which look at specific policy measures such as anti-discrimination measures, language courses, etc., which are closely linked to the labor market, and they find that these measures are the most effective in supporting labor market integration. And finally, there is also increasingly research looking mainly at asylum-related immigrants. And this research finds, for instance, that a long waiting period is detrimental for labor market integration, or inclusive labor market policies, they can favor this integration. And the third and last aspect I wanted to look at regards this psychological or social aspect of social bridges, bonds, and links with the society or the country of destination. So here we can relate to this research by social and political psychologists, which suggests that these integration policies, they send important symbolic signs of inclusion or exclusion towards their immigrant population, which may also affect them. So I always like to refer here to this statement by Reskens and Verkuiten, who wrote in a study. So it makes really a difference if you send a warm handshake, if you give a warm handshake, or if you show the cold shoulder via the policy environment, so that this really affects how people react, how welcome they feel. And what we find in our research, for instance, in this study by Anita Manatschal, is that the immigrant sense of belonging to the country is significantly increased if they reside in a more inclusive context. So to sum up, across all these different literature of social psychology, of economy, of political science, we find rather mixed evidence, but a clear tendency towards better inclusion in inclusive settings. But nevertheless, the mixed evidence is a bit puzzling, and in the paper we argue that this mixed evidence is not least due to some limitations of existing studies. So we discuss some of them in our paper. For instance, many of these large N studies across many countries based on cross-sectional correlation analysis or regression analysis. So these studies, they bring all kinds of endogeneity issues to the table. So is it really the policies that are more inclusive that foster more integration, or is it better integration outcomes that favor the adoption of more inclusive policies, or is it maybe a third factor that affects policies and integration outcomes, such as a more open political climate, more open public opinion? So that's the limitation of these cross-sectional correlation studies in pinpointing or in kind of identifying really the policy effect. Another point which is also important to mention here is that these large N integration policy indices, such as the Migrant Integration Policy Index, they are very broad and they typically have no clearly defined target group. So many of these indices, they combine policies which are addressed to different immigrant groups, and you would agree that it's not kind of an asylum seeker. It's not the same category of an immigrant such as a high-skilled expat, for instance, right? And often different policies are formulated for these different groups. So how can our research contribute to this and maybe also overcome these limitations? So we propose in our study that it can add to the precision of the estimate to analyze the policy effect, but also to not neglect the complexity of the policy field. So we have kind of both precision and complexity. So what does that mean? We aim at analytic precision via our quasi-experimental research design, because there was this policy reform implemented in Switzerland between 2006 and 2008, an exogenous policy reform, which targeted one particular group of asylum-related migrants, F permit holders, who have a provisional admission to Switzerland, but not N permit holders, asylum seekers. And I will say a few more words about these two groups in a second. And so the third point that we can account for in our study is that we also can adopt a realistic setting, kind of analyze a realistic setting, because often these experimental or quasi-experimental studies, they adopt a very simplistic perspective, or they just are just interested in single aspects such as waiting periods, etc. But they kind of neglect that asylum-related immigrants or immigrants more broadly are exposed to a whole range of other policies and policy measures. So we can at least adopt a more realistic perspective in this study, because we consider this wide range of policy measures that were adopted in the reform package. So let's turn now to the case description and the asylum-related permits that are in the focus of our study. So in theory, you have asylum seekers who have an N permit, which means they wait for a decision, right? So if you have an N permit, there will at a certain point be a decision taken about whether you classify or qualify as a refugee. Then you will get the B permit, a quite stable permit in Switzerland. Or if you do not qualify for refugee, but you cannot be sent back to your country of origin because, for instance, there is a war in the meantime in your country of origin, then you would be attributed a provisional admission status, so a so-called F permit, which is intermediary, right, between acceptance or rejection, because you do not know what the outcome will be in the provisional admission, or your application can be rejected. For instance, because another Schengen country is responsible for your asylum application, and you should go back to that country. In reality, of course, the situation is much more complex, and I just would like to show you this jungle of residence permits, and it's in French. And even if you do not speak French, you will get the gist of this kind of figure here, just to show you that the pathways between the different kind of decisions are much more complex than the theory would suggest on the left. But in this paper here, we're really interested in the asylum seekers, so the N permits, as compared to the F permit holders, the provisional admission individuals. Why? Because there was this integration policy reform adopted between 2006 and 2008, which introduced some improvements in terms of access to certain rights for F permit holders, but not N permit holders. So the point of departure in the early 2000s was that the F permit holders, it turns out that it's not at all a temporary residence permit, right? People often stay for a very long time, if not forever, in Switzerland, although the label was kind of provisional admission. And at the same time, their integration into society was not at all officially supported or promoted. So as a consequence, we had a very high unemployment rate in this group, and the official authorities, they realized we need to do something, because these people, they often stay for a long time, if not forever, in Switzerland. We need to support their integration. So there was this bundle of policy measures that was adopted. So from after 2008, F permit holders were also eligible for state funding of social and economic integration programs. So they could access language courses, they could access some labor market qualification classes, etc. They had also access to family reunification after a certain period of residence. And the third improvement regarded the fact that they now, from 2008 on, well, the implementation already started a bit earlier, but let's say between 2006 and 2008, it was implemented that they had equal access to the labor market, Swiss citizens or EU citizens or legal permanent residents. So there was no longer a labor market integration. The N permit holders, in contrast, they didn't profit from any of these changes, right? So we obviously expected that this considerable improvement of the legal situation and the access to rights for F permit holders would have also had noticeable and measurable impact on the integration outcomes of this F group compared to the N group after reform as compared to before the reform, right? So that's our main hypothesis that we tested. And we did this using data, two sets of data. The first data set is the health monitoring of the Swiss migrant population, the GMM, which provided information on migrants' health, health-related behavior, and health-related services. So the target group of this survey were immigrants who were underrepresented in conventional surveys due to language problems. So that means that in this survey, we had also a large, it's not very large, but at least a certain sample group of asylum-related immigrants. And since this survey was conducted in 2004 and 2010, meaning shortly before the reform and some years after reform, we could use this data to analyze how the reform affected individuals in this group of F permit holders relative to N permit holders just before and after the reform. And here I'll just present some quick info on the sample. So we focused on asylum-related Sri Lankans. Why Sri Lankans? First, because it was the only asylum-related group that was included in both waves, 2004 and 2010. So we could compare them. And second, at the time, in this period, Sri Lankans represented one of the largest asylum-related groups in Switzerland. So we focused on the working age population, and we're interested in some outcomes at the individual level, some integration outcomes, such as knowledge and speaking the national language, employment status, the income, whether the income has been increased via this reform. And in terms of social well-being, we had measures on the feeling of having, no longer having a homeland, so the feeling of being without a homeland, and also the feeling of loneliness that we used as psychological well-being measures. And we run some difference in differences regression analyses. Just quick word on the register data. That's the second data we used. So here we could rely on official Swiss register data, meaning of the full population, right? Full F and N population living in Switzerland, not just a random sample. So it's like the universe of all observations in Switzerland. And we could merge register data on the asylum-related population and social security data to get at the employment status of the individuals, right? So this data provides us with more, let's say, breadth. So we have the full sample, but less depth in the sense that we have only the employment outcome that we can look at. Again, we run some difference in differences analysis using individual fixed effects. So we had panel data of the same individuals over 13 years from 2000 to 2013. And for each year, we had the employment situation, and we could check if from 2006 on, there was kind of an increase of the employment in the F permit population relative to the N permit holders. Let's turn now to the results. Starting with the GMM, the survey data that I presented to you first. So here we were analyzing the effects of this integration policy reform on Sri Lankans who have an F permit in Switzerland. And in the figure on the left hand, you can see the results for all these different variables. So the two employment variables, employment and income, the language proficiency, and then the psychological outcomes, feeling of having no homeland and feeling of loneliness. And what is expressed by the dots and the vertical, the horizontal lines in blue and in red are the coefficients for the F permit holders compared to the vertical 0 line, which are our reference category, the refugees, like the asylum seekers with an N permit who could not profit. So just to briefly sum up these results, we can see that relative to an N permit, to M permit holders, the policy reform from 2006 to 2008 increased labor market inclusion. It increased also language skills, especially when it comes to good knowledge in a Swiss language, and psychological well-being, because it reduced the feeling of having no homeland and the feeling of loneliness. Although the insecurity, the confidence intervals are quite broad and almost touch the 0 line, the vertical 0 line, but it's clearly on the negative side, right? So there is a negative effect on feeling to have no homeland and feeling of loneliness among F permit holders, thanks to the policy reform, right? So overall confirmation of our hypothesis, and luckily the same can be said of the register data analysis based on the full population of F and N permit holders. On the left, we singled out again asylum-related Sri Lankans, just for the sake of comparability also with the GMM data. And you can see that the trend for F permit holders, which are expressed by the blue dots and lines, and the horizontal 0 line represents, again, the reference category of N permit holders. Employment trend goes up significantly, right? Especially after 2006 and 2008. And this trend is even stronger and clearer and more pronounced in the right figure, where you have all asylum-related migrants, right? So there is a clear benefit of having an F status when it comes to labor market inclusion after this reform has been adopted in 2006 to 2008. So this brings me to the conclusion, and first to a little summary. Okay, our first question was kind of, do integration policies matter? I would say our results clearly can support or affirm this question. Yes, they do matter. We found in particular a beneficial effect of the Swiss integration policy reform on labor market inclusion of all provisionally admitted individuals in general, based on the registry data, but also of Sri Lankans in particular, a much smaller sample, but still the trend there is also already visible. And the GMM analysis also showed that the reform improved language skills and psychological well-being of provisionally admitted Sri Lankans in Switzerland. So this brings me to my last slide, concluding remarks. So it's actually a common sense in research, or acknowledged wisdom in research, but also in like the public discourses, that integration processes are interdependent, right? Language skills and psychological well-being and social connections may benefit labor market integration, and vice versa. If you're integrated in the labor market, that may probably also benefit your social connections, your social integration, ideally also your psychological well-being. And our findings actually clearly support also this interpretation or this reading. We find that these comprehensive integration policy reform packages, which address simultaneously different aspects of immigrant integration, are a particularly efficient tool for fostering inclusion. Voila, that's it from my side. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion later on.